One of the great things for me about learning via YouTube has been all of the recommendations that people send to me. It's quite common for people to say on my channel, I don't have time to watch all your videos. And that's true. Well, I don't have time to watch all my videos or all the videos that Joe Rogan or all of these other people put out. So it's really awesome when not only one person, but a number of people recommend a particular video to me. And part of why this video was recommended to me was that Andrew Doyle, who Titania McGrath, he's the creator of that Twitter site. Why he the interview that he did with Joe Rogan and how he mentioned Tom Holland and Dominion. But I thought that the conversation was interesting, especially in terms of how Andrew Doyle and Joe Rogan sort of found each other in terms of a religion or a common religion. So let's jump into this.
You know, it's those younger comics, right, who are coming up and they
now they're both quite bothered by the rise of woke culture, and what that's doing, especially to the comedians. Not so much really the large comedians. Ricky Gervais has, obviously doing things on the Golden Globe, but they're worried about the young comics coming up.
Censor because they're worried about what they're going to say. That's basically what it is. I mean, I had an argument with a young comic, and she said to me, you don't understand, because I have to go up to comics every night after their set and explain to them why they shouldn't tell these jokes and why they this was a serious conversation. I thought, this isn't for you.
And she was a comic?
Yeah, stand up. Yeah. This was a comic in a group. So I used to run this workshop for young stand-ups, and I can't do it anymore because one of them complained. This is serious, right? So one of them complained to the boss. It's a very famous theatre in London, and one of them complained and said that one of the jokes I'd tweeted as Titania made her feel unsafe, and then therefore I was told I couldn't do this course anymore because I developed an unsafe environment.
Oh, you made them feel unsafe.
Yeah, by a joke.
Dangerous.
That wasn't even it was a character.
Must have been a great joke.
Probably a fucking great joke, yeah.
So good, you made someone feel unsafe.
Yeah.
Like they were laughing so hard.
Yeah.
They're like, I could die.
Yeah.
I could die from laughter.
But that's that conflation of words and violence, isn't it? This idea
that is a problem.
And I think what really scares me about that is I think they believe it.
It's disingenuous.
Do you think it's disingenuous?
Yes, it's clearly.
Now, this division between them is very interesting. It's disingenuous. Well, it might be for some, might be in some times in some places, or is it genuine? And what's really interesting here is Andrew Doyle's notice or his assumption of how we can tell the genuine thing. I listened to Joe Rogan's conversation with Bill Maher and was really interested in that. And of course, I have way more ideas for videos than I ever have time to make videos. And I was considering making a video on that because in his conversation with Bill Maher, both he and Joe Rogan noticed that one of the interesting things about humor is that it's pre-voluntary. It's in a sense a way, it's sort of analogous to why Jung and Freud looked at their dreams. It was a way for our conscious watcher to gain insight into that self underneath that we don't necessarily have access to. That self that is expressing itself in intuition and emotions and all kinds of different things. So that self that often we can't control, when that self is acting in ways that we, in terms of this persona that we imagine ourselves to be, that we don't want to do. And so gaining insight into that in ourselves, well, that's sort of what Freud and Jung, why they kept looking at dreams. Gaining insight into each other, which is what Bill Maher and Joe Rogan do in terms of comedy. Comedy is in some ways a psychological dream assessment. Now, what Andrew Doyle sees in this person is, and in other people, is the reality of the self underneath. That in terms of, now if we were to just listen to this video, because I don't know Andrew Doyle very well, and I've watched enough of Joe Rogan. They're sort of modernists. They're sort of liberal modernists. And I don't mean liberal in terms of left wing. I mean liberal in terms of classical liberal. And that's who they are. And what modernists are almost always surprised at is in fact this self underneath, that maybe I'm not transparent to myself, maybe I don't really have control of myself, maybe the me that I think I am isn't necessarily me. How could I be that complicated?
Really disingenuous, but it's the orthodoxy, right? Like this is what they're pushing.
Okay, now you'll hear Joe Rogan. What's very interesting about this video is Joe Rogan has been colonized to some degree by Jordan Peterson, and that comes through. He's going to start using some Jordan Peterson-esque language, but he's also been colonized by Sam Harris and that side of things. And so you'll hear a repetition of, oh, it's dogma, as if, dogma is something that religious people have and the rest of us don't have. Oh, okay. Well, we're does your idea, do you hold this idea of dogma dogmatically? So this is very interesting.
So
it's disingenuous.
Do you think it's disingenuous?
Yes, it's clearly disingenuous, but it's the orthodoxy, right? Like this is what they're pushing.
So
they're pushing that words are violence and that you can be violent with words.
So that's interesting because I think you're probably right in a lot of cases. When they say, like, if they see a certain image or something, it makes them feel like they've been physically attacked, or they hear a certain phrase or whatever.
In other words, Andrew Doyle is saying, well, maybe they're disingenuous, so this is performative. This is a public performance that they're doing consciously in order to be an activist, achieve a social goal, virtue signal, whatever you're doing. But right away, then we have the difference between the person behind the mask and the creation of the mask that we're presenting to the world in order to shape the world and achieve a certain outcome in a rational way in the world. But what happens when the mask slips?
And they support each other in this nonsense.
But then I see some of them bawling their eyes out, crying and shaking, and I think that's an authentic emotion, right? So maybe it's disingenuous in some cases, but maybe some people have actually, and this would scare me more, that some people have actually convinced themselves that it is a kind of form of violence.
I'm sure.
Why would that scare you more? Well, I think it would scare him more, not only in terms of empathy for the other people, but what it probably says about his worldview. That the sort of psychologically naive posture of some modernism is deeply disturbed by the fact that human beings are as malleable and open to colonization as they are. Because, well, if that's true of other people, is that true of me? Well, I don't think it's true of me, because I think everything that I think is right, because if I didn't think it, I would think otherwise. Sure. That's how we all are. Now, Rogan's going to then play the religion card. Oh, so there's these two modes of human beings. There's human beings being genuine, authentic, rational selves, and then there's the religious mode.
I'm sure that's true as well. I'm sure that's true as well. And I think this is, again, parallels really crazy religious people.
Right.
Right? I mean, there's people that will cut off fingers for, slights and against their...
There are people who will cut off fingers or have doctors cut off fingers because doctors say things about those fingers that you must cut off that finger in order to save their life. There are people who cut off other parts of their body because they think that that alteration will somehow make them more of something or less of something else. I just had my hair cut off. What's behind that?
Their religion, they'll flog themselves. People do horrendous things to them.
Horrendous. Okay, well, why are these things horrendous? So obviously there's a moral system behind this that Joe Rogan is appealing to, and well, what's going on here?
Themselves as punishment.
Right. So then it comes, if we are going to go with the religious motif, it comes about sort of de-radicalizing people from this belief.
Another theme in this video was, well, you take anything, if anything can go too far. But, Joe Rogan's not shy of certain kinds of radicalism. Well, what do we mean by radicalism? Well, we're meaning change in a certain direction.
System.
It seems like this is a part of being a human, that there are pathways that people go down, just to get away from.
Now this is where Joe Rogan, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, for those of you who have watched the show for longer, that this is we're seeing the zeitgeist move here, okay? That it used to be religion is sort of this optional thing that other people do. Now maybe religion is something about being human. We might start asking questions about, well, what is religion? Is religion a thing separate from normal life, secular life? And now again, we're beating on Tom Holland's door in this stuff.
From that, here's one:
Okay.
the dictator. Right? The horrific dictator. When someone gets into a position of power over someone, whether it's a CEO of a company, before the Me Too movement that's out of control and is trying to fuck all of his employees and treats people like shit and sexually harasses everybody. God damn it, that seems like an archetype, right? It's like,
it's an archetype. It's something that happens, that it's something we play out. It's something above ourselves. The Greeks would imagine it to be a spirit that takes possession of ourselves, but that sounds too religious.
this archetype seems to almost be unavoidable with certain types of human beings.
Sure.
Well, then we'd have to ask ourselves, well, can we identify these types of human beings? What kinds are these human beings that they have types? How do I know if I'm such a type of human being?
I think you get that with the woke thing, and that the structure of wokeness is just it is just a scaffolding for this sort of antiquated, not antiquated, excuse me, this ancient system of behavior, this religious system, and it slides right into that. And I don't think it's a...
Now, I think, again, correct me if I'm wrong, for those of you who are much more faithful Joe Rogan viewers than I am, I think we're continuing to see the evolution of Joe Rogan in this. I think we're continuing to see the culture change. I think we're continuing to see kind of this the Overton window moving along with respect to what is religion and what is not religion, and how inevitable religion really is.
A coincidence that most woke people are atheists, because this is their alternative for radical religion.
As if others aren't, as if we all aren't playing religions. And again, now here comes a Tom Holland reference.
I think that's probably right. Tom Holland is a historian. He wrote a book recently called Dominion. He makes this case that with the absence of Christianity, in comes wokeness. That one sort of just follows from the other in a kind of, because they have the similar need to proselytize, to convert, the similar intolerance of anyone who might not perceive the world in the way that you do. You know, so.
Andrew Doyle, there's a lot more in that book than just that segment. There's a lot more in that book about, well, first, we didn't know what religion was because there was no such thing as religion. One of the things that might shock people is that the word religion, I checked it in the KJV this morning, is only found twice in the King James Bible, really. It comes from the book of James, and some of you might be surprised at what's the book of James calls religion, this book in the Bible. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves. James is saying, if you're religious, well, what did James mean by that word in the first century in a Jewish context? Now, a lot of theories about which James this is writing this book. A lot of people think it's James the Just, who was the brother of Jesus, who came late to the party in terms of accepting his own brother as the Son of God. That would, especially for a Jew, be a very reasonable thing to have to overcome. But those who consider themselves religious, yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues, deceive themselves. So right away we see, well, the self and the other self, okay? And their religion is worthless. Oh, their religion is worthless. Religious people ought to keep tight reins on their tongue. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows, something that I think Andrew Doyle and Joe Rogan would both say, yeah, that's really important. That's moral. That's what we should do, looking after the weak and the powerless. Read Tom Holland's Dominion. Where did we get this idea? We didn't get it from the Romans. We didn't get it from the Greeks. We might, maybe to be Roman and Greek to show ourselves as being merciful, that performative sense. Well, Jesus will address that in the Sermon on the Mount. I still have to record my rough draft for Sunday where I'm going to treat that a little bit, which will probably be posted before this video, so that comment doesn't do you much good. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is to look after widows and orphans in their distress. Yeah, so Joe Rogan and Andrew Doyle would say, yeah, that's what it means to be good. I don't know where we got that idea. It just kind of came down to us. And to keep oneself being polluted from the world. Well, that one sounds like these narrow religious people. So what we find is that at first, you would think the word religion would be all over the Bible, but it isn't. Well, why not? Because as Tom Holland says, and I don't know if I'll play any of it in this video, but as he says in one recent podcast interview that I think the more often he says this stuff, the clearer I hear it, perhaps the clearer he's saying it. At first, there was no religion. What do you mean there was no religion? People just did what they did in order to make their way in the world, to offer a sacrifice and to take a trek across the desert wasn't necessarily religious. It was just what you did. It was what you ought to do, what you had to do. That was what you practiced. It was the ritual. It was all of these things. And then suddenly, bit by bit, we get the understanding that there's the religious and there's the not religious. There's the seculum, the secular, that which we do sort of within our lifetime. And then, you can connect this with the two worlds mythology. You have heaven and earth. And so somehow life is split between what we normally do and then what we religiously do. And then eventually comes along the idea that, well, can we get rid of the religious stuff? Because that stuff seems to not really be working or doing anything. The normal stuff, that's what's important. And so we're only going to allow the normal stuff into government, and we're going to keep the religious stuff outside of government. We're going to, in the Great American Experiment, we're going to separate, now pay attention, American Experiment doesn't say separate religion from life. Because, well, that is in many ways the questions. Can you do that? Joe Rogan has a revelation that the woke are religious. Oh. The next revelation Joe Rogan is going to have is he religious? And therefore, what really is religious? Now, Tom Holland in one of his videos talks about threskos or threskia, this word that gets translated in the book of James as religion. Well, where does that word come from? So I'm pulling out Little Kittle here, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, goes back into the origins of words. There's the big Kittle, which on your shelf would be about this wide. I have all mine in my computer because if you think I have a lot of books now, if I didn't have them all in my computer, I'd have about 3 times as many as you see behind me. So what's the origin of this word? Well, this word is very common in Greek, but it's very rare. The LXX is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and in the New Testament, it's very rare. Well, why would this word be rare? Why would this word be so rare in such a religious book? The etymology of the word is disputed. Early suggestions were derivations from thrace, or threomai, to tremble, while modern scholars like to favor the word to serve. Now, you'll notice with these words, things are going to go in very interesting directions because it could go towards the therapeutic. Well, if I am being a therapist, I am serving you, I am healing you, I am catering to you. Now that word, if you pull, well, here it is. If you pull Philip Rice, The Triumph of the Therapeutic, talking about, this talks a lot about religion and what we say no to and what we don't say no to. Or to tremble. Well, what is it to be religious? It's to tremble before someone else, to tremble before something else. Now, just like Tom Holland notes that in many of these fights that we see going on, Christianity really is below both of them. There's even a conservatism built into Joe Rogan's distrust of certain radicalisms, because conservatism is sort of built on the idea that maybe I'm not as smart as I am. Maybe I'm not as capable as I am. Maybe I should change, or maybe I should not change. Maybe I should act, or maybe I should not act. And that comes from a certain, well, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, says the book of Proverbs. That comes, the fear of the future is the beginning of labor, perhaps, to tremble. So this worshiping, this religion is to tremble. Now, religio, of course, in Latin will be to bind. And what's interesting is that we see this constellation of words sort of coming together. And you often have that in English because you've got some Greek words that come up into it. And you've got some words from Germanic and some other roots that come bringing. Distinction of meaning may also be noted, a good sense of religious zeal. Well, if you read For Which Thracian Women Were Noted, this is exactly the kind of zeal that Joe Rogan is talking about. Worship of God, religion, Josephus in his Antiquities, Acts 26, the Apostle Paul. If you read N.T. Wright's biography of the Apostle Paul, which is an excellent book, N.T. Wright begins right away with Paul's zeal. That's a religious zeal, that Paul is hunting down Christians in order to maintain his religion. And that act of zealotry is deeply tied to religion, which is exactly what Joe Rogan and Andrew Doyle are complaining about. But there's also a bad sense, religious excess, and that's what Joe Rogan was talking about, cutting off fingers, wearing hair shirts, whipping oneself, wrong religion. This is the point of 2 Colossians 2, where it's talking about the worship of angels. Now, Andy Banstrom, my New Testament teacher back in the day in Calvin Seminary, kind of flipped that around. Is it worshiping angels, or a certain sect that was promising that their particular religion mirrored and offered the kinds of worship that angels do, because of course angels are closer, and religious communities and religious traditions are full of these kinds of working through ideas, because they sit a long time on something and they work it over and they work it over and they work it over, which is kind of the opposite of Americans, which is clip, 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 all new. And so that leads to Americans now saying, ooh, monks, because they stop and they work things over. And the bad sense is not intrinsically necessary, is added to the genitive. Threskia is a colorless word, rather like cultist can be used that way. Language is amazing. So, on and on and on we go with this idea of religion. Well, what on earth is religion? Now, very quickly we get into the sense of ritual. Well, what is a ritual? We imagine that ritual is this thing that we perform, and it's very deeply tied to religious. It's very deeply tied to the cult. It's this thing that we perform. Now, one of the interesting things in a lot of these interesting little psychological experiments they're doing with chimps and younger humans is that, what about these rituals? And so what in this particular video comes from National Geographic. What ritual are they setting up for these chimps to try to learn to do?
To prove that one ape can copy another, a student of Andrew
Also copying. Culture.
Whiten's devised an experiment. At the University of Texas, Antoine Spiteri has built a kind of slot machine for apes. He loads it with a grape. To get the fruit, a chimp must first turn a disc to allow the grape to drop through a hole. Next, a chimp must move a door that opens a handle to release the fruit payout. Spiteri now trains a chimp named Judy how to work the device. On her own, she would never work it out. But thanks to a sweet liquid reward, she learns the sequence's 2 steps.
I love that little do this thing, ooh, have a little reward. Now do this thing, and so what you see again is, you know, sort of Pavlov's dog. You're creating this little chain in the chimp's mind that, okay, here's this little chain. I get something I want. Ooh, I'm going to do this other thing. I get something I want, and then you kind of pull it back. And anybody who's trained a dog or a cat or a child kind of understands this ritual to colonize the chimp.
Rotate, then push. Next, Judy's group mates enter. Spiteri wants to know if, just by watching, the spectators will learn the technique.
Are we establishing chimp religion?
Can these apes ape to win this food-finding game? One chimp seems to think she's got it and shoves Judy aside. A minute ago, Judy
A little bit of dominance in there.
was the only one with the knowledge. Now, another has it, and quickly the trick spreads throughout the group. But for Spiteri, the most important question remains. Have the next-door neighbors also learned the solution? They have no social ties to the original group. In fact, they are hostile towards them. Will they set that aside to keep up with the Joneses next door? In no time at all, they're working the slot machine like old pros. Rotating, then pushing the handle. Learning by imitation is an essential skill for culture, and culture, along with the complex thoughts and emotions behind it, was long believed to be uniquely human.
Oh, how about that? Well, chimps learn things and achieve ends that we can fairly easily see through them. So they want the little fruit reward, and so here's the little game, and so they do the slot machine and they get their little fruit, and then the other chimp watches and, ooh, they've learned how to do it and they get it too. But exactly what problems are they solving? Because these chimps aren't relying on the machine to feed them daily. Is that the problem? What problem are we really looking at here? And is this actually learning from each other to survive, or is there a desire that is being fulfilled? And exactly what desire is being fulfilled? Now, let's go. This might even be from the same documentary I found on a different YouTube thing. Let's look at children, because, you know, this sort of...
Do we have any mental skills which are uniquely our own? A key clue comes from a new experiment. Back at the University of Texas,
I kind of wonder what chimp rituals are thinking with these people pushing carts to the cages. So like, oh, maybe set up a little idol for the people moving the carts.
Victoria Horner shows a chimp how to operate a puzzle box to get a treat. First, she taps. Then, she slots. Next, she pokes.
I wonder how much time it took for this chimp to learn.
The chimp copies fairly well and gets the sweet.
This game we're gonna play is about this special box I brought, all right? There's a gummy bear. It's your turn.
children copy the actions much as the chimps did.
Oh, you got him. All right, there's a gummy bear. Good job.
The second box that I show the chimpanzees is this one, and it's identical to the opaque box, except that it's made out of material which is see-through.
Only now is it obvious that the tapping and poking don't achieve a thing. The box has a false ceiling.
Don't achieve a thing. Built into that little language word is the assumption of what the thing is you're seeking.
The chimps cut to the chase. They skip the needless steps. For the apes, it
Needless steps. Again, John Vervaeke, relevance realization. What is relevant to what game are they playing?
is all about the treat.
What this study shows is that apes don't just mindlessly ape. They also understand something more about cause and effect.
We found something quite surprising. The children were predisposed to copy, even when it meant that they were doing something that was really rather silly. So
Silly? What game do you think the child is playing? Have you ever had a child? You can sit with a child and play games for a good long time that involve no treat at all. You're imagining that the child and the chimp are playing the same game.
this seems a little like the chimps are outsmarting the kids in this particular study.
There he is. You got him out.
Why do children imitate slavishly?
Slavishly?
At the root of the children's behavior is the fact that they view me as a grown-up, possibly as a teacher.
That children expect to be taught is a vital difference.
Where did they learn that? That they expect to be taught? I mean, we're doing a fair amount of mind reading all along the way here. What exactly is at play in the mind and the desire of the child? You can't ask the child. The child doesn't know. Slavishly. No, maybe if this nice person came that was nicely dressed and brought them a little box for tapping and moving and pushing completely without the gummy bear, they might just keep tapping and moving and pushing anyway. Now, what we imagine, however, when I play this in the context of ritual, is that, to a certain degree, our pragmatic eyes, filters through which we look at all of this, well, maybe I can begin to see this. And maybe I'll begin to wonder, well, what is ritual? What is religion? What game is the child playing? What strange thing that they keep doing this useless ritual? Is it a useless ritual? But there is a human in the room. Maybe it's a teacher. Maybe they're regarding it as a teacher. What game did the child start? Who started the game? When did the game start? Was the child aware of any of it? What do you mean aware? Consciously aware? Could the child articulate it? But in fact, what game was the child playing? Was the child looking for the gummy bear to feed themselves? Again, this gets into Vervaeke's relevance realization, the question of what a problem is. Now, there's no essence to relevance, because relevant towards what? Relevant for what? We watch the monkey video and we're already forming ideas about what is the goal, the telos, the good. What if we don't know what? What if we don't know anything? What, in fact, do we know in this whole thing? I want to bring in Dru Johnson. Now, again, this is another example of quite a while ago, a number of people said, oh, watch some of his videos, read his books. Dru Johnson teaches at the King's University, and he's been paying attention to this question of ritual and religion. Now, this, again, has been not only, it tends to happen in a lot of theology, is theology tends to wander around and follow a lot of things that are going on, because theology is sort of this broad, generalist thing. Now, again, Joe Rogan might imagine theology is over here and that this is sort of useless. This is one of these religious things. But theology is always keeping its ear open to a lot of different things. And so a lot of the cognitive science, the John Vervaeke stuff, this is actually very interesting to theologians. Why? Well, because they agree with everything? No. But because we're trying to figure out, well, why does the word religion hardly appear in the Bible? Dru Johnson did something very interesting in that we have all these detailed explanations in the book of Leviticus and in the book of Exodus. And I often note that people start wanting to read the Bible, and so they'll start in Genesis and, all these cool stories. And Jordan Peterson talked about that. Then they get into Exodus, and the first half of the book of Exodus, this is really cool, in the desert and the Red Sea crossing and all that. Then they get into the second half of the book of Exodus, and it's all no fun anymore, because it's all these rules and these laws and the furniture of the tabernacle and all of this stuff. And we're like, what happened to the fun Bible to read? What happened to the relevance of it? So Dru Johnson and some others decided, well, could we, on the basis of this written text, actually act it out? And what they discovered is that they couldn't. And he was working with someone, this is on another video that I'm not going to play today. He was working with someone who was a doctor, who was a surgeon, and he noted that, all of this surgery stuff, this seems very connected with all of the rituals that the Old Testament did. Now, what's really funny is that a little bit later I'm going to play Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein and Sam Harris talking, because that's what I do. And Sam Harris would look at that and say, that's all this archaic nonsense. Okay. He says that on one hand. Then he says religions don't change on the other hand. And it's like, Sam, when you went to the synagogue, was there any blood? Did they sacrifice anything? Even the most observant Jews you can find, they're not sacrificing anywhere. Well, why not? Well, because there's no temple. The really interesting question would be if, in fact, through some major political stuff, that the Dome of the Rock would be cleared out, and the state of Israel were to obtain and decide they wish to rebuild the temple. Now, a whole bunch of certain kinds of Christians would all get very excited about that, and in my opinion, a theological heresy. But would, if they rebuilt the temple, and another question is, why don't they? If they rebuilt the temple, would sacrifices continue? Why or why not? Sam Harris says, well, religions don't change. It's all this dogma, this archaic stuff. And really? Why aren't they sacrificing on the temple? What has happened? What is religion really? Why do Christians and Jews and Christians and Jews say, well, all of those passages in the book of Leviticus and Exodus, those remain the word of God, but they don't hold slaves or necessarily practice all of those words the way those words are written. Why don't they do sacrifices? Why don't they, in lieu of another temple, why don't they create another tabernacle? Well, why? Well, we don't. We're mysteries to ourselves. And so part of it that we tend to focus on is all of this theology and all this talk and all this language and all this theory. But what about what we actually do and how we actually work our lives? This is Dru introducing this book that he wrote called Human Rights, but he had a better title for it.
I need to get it right. The chapter that I want to read from is called Priestly Monkeys Banging on Their Ritual Typewriters, which I tried to convince the publisher to title the book that, and they would not go for it. And the section that I want to read from is about death rituals, the ritual scripts that are handed to us from our traditions. And so I'm just going to read a few pages, and I'll try to animate the reading as best I can. In his book, The Liturgy of Death, Eastern Orthodox theologian Alexander Schmemann attacks the American funeral machine. Why? The funeral machinery wants to medicalize and conceal death from us, quote, to render that loss for us, the survivors, as something painless, smooth, and unnoticeable as possible, end quote. Schmemann continues, quote, in its attitude towards death, a culture defines and reveals its understanding of life's meaning and goal, end quote. In other words, American culture creates this script, shaping not only our view of grief, but also our view of life itself. Schmemann asks us to consider...
I love how life itself gets mentioned. Nod to Nathan Jacobs and those videos I made.
This question, by what right do we let the funeral machine script our death rituals? To broaden this question out, we might ask, by what right do we let the machinery of our culture script our daily rituals? And what other cultural traditions do we dutifully follow without question? Who would have thought that survivors could sort out death by a disconnected phone in a booth? After the 2000 tsunami that struck Japan, oh, there you go. The 2011 tsunami that struck Japan, entire villages mourned the loss of friends and family. How could the communities deal with such pain on a massive scale? When the Japanese funeral machine went silent, one man had a simple idea to help the people engage with their loss. He transformed a common action, making a phone call, into a grieving ritual.
Here's a question. Was it religious?
Talking to the dead in a phone booth. The phone booth is normal in every way, except the phone doesn't work, at least not in the usual sense of the word. The booth sits secluded on the man's rural property. This is actually the booth itself here. Though the phone isn't hooked up, the grieving come to connect. Survivors can be seen dialing numbers known only to them, and then they talk to their dead. The ordinariness of this ritual seems to help them navigate this extraordinary circumstance. It gives them what scientists call deliberately controlled gestures to follow. The conversations they have with their dead sisters, brothers, fathers, mothers, children, friends, and more shock those who haven't spent much time around the grieving. Here's one such conversation from a man to his parents, to his wife, who is called Mine, and his infant son, who's called Issei. They all perished in the tsunami. The man speaks these words through the phone, in the booth, and through his tears. And I think his pain deserves to be read slowly. Dad, Mom, Mine, Issei, it's been 5 years already since the disaster. If this voice reaches you, please listen. Sometimes I don't know what I'm living for. Issei, please let me hear you call me Papa. Even though I built a new house. Dad, Mom, Mine, Issei, without all of you, it's meaningless. I want to hear your reply, but I can't hear anything. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. It's wrenching stuff. How would we console him? What path would we trace for him to walk out?
If he went to a funeral, what well-meaning words would be offered to this man? And again, the example is poignant because you're looking at a situation where the infrastructure has been decimated. Not decimated, decimated is a tenth, destroyed. And well, what can we do to help each other survive? And even what does that mean?
This man is like many others who come here. In this booth, they talk without shame to the dead, as if they were on the other end of the line. The phone in the booth provides familiarity and privacy, and the conversations are strange and soul-bearing at the same time. They expose the furthest reaches of a human's being. The disconnected phone actually works. In such times, grieving people have to do something. So even when a man creates...
And it's even that. Grieving people have to do something. Well, why? Well, why are they grieving? And this is, in a sense, the question that certain kinds of modernism can't answer. Why are they grieving? Well, other people are dead. Well, are you threatened? Do you have food? Well, I'm okay. Why? What am I that the cessation of another in a world of which 8 other billion people, most of which I'm completely indifferent towards, many of whom die every day? What is it about a human being that if a particular other person dies, it can be disabling, even lethal? And what do we need to do in order to address that? A phone book? A phone booth with a phone that goes nowhere? If you're going to wonder about religion, that's actually not a bad place to start.
It's an unusual new tradition. People try it. What's interesting, and I think it's significant, is that the mourner's phone booth strategically modifies an everyday practice so that grieving families might be able to discern a way forward, to detect the trail from the sheer jungle of their loss. Traditions can also create more detailed ritual scripts. Jewish tradition has well-known death rituals for survivors too. Their rites have historical and sometimes faintly biblical roots. For instance, someone must sit with the body of the deceased at all times until burial. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called sitting Shiva, where Shiva refers to the 7 days of mourning, which include fasting from the normal pleasures of life. After burial, ritual mourning continues. Loved ones may wear torn clothing as a sign of their grief, and different traditions within Judaism may extend the period of mourning to a year, depending on one's relationship to the dead. But mourning has final punctuation. After the period of mourning ends, it's no longer appropriate to mourn. For most Jews, these rituals are not optional. The community expects them, just as Christians usually expect a memorial service and a cemetery burial.
Now, it's also interesting that in past years, let's say a widow who would have lost her husband would wear black for a year. A man might wear an armband. This signals the entire community that this person is in mourning, and they have to treat them in a slightly different way than if the person is not in mourning. Again, these rituals are all over the place.
But despite the cultural pressure to perform these rituals, that pressure doesn't necessarily diminish their value to the mourners. Though not particularly religious anymore, Jonathan Safran Foer writes about this aspect of Jewish death rituals, noting that we need such deliberately controlled gestures just at these moments.
What do you mean we need them? Why do we need them? Could this be related to the children tapping the sticks? Why is it that the children continue tapping the sticks while the monkeys just went for the food?
He says this: Judaism gets death right. It instructs us what to do when we know least well what to do.
Judaism gets death right. See, now, some person who wants to remake humanity might say, well, death is not a big deal. The problem with death, the reason we suffer from death, is because we have been trained to suffer from death, just like those little children were tapping the top of the trick box. And if we didn't have a history that trained us to tap the box when someone died, we'd shrug and move on.
And feel an overwhelming need to do something. You should sit like this. We will. You should dress like this. We will. You should say these words at these moments, even if you have to read them from a transliteration. We will. I think that really captures very well how ritual can be helpful at times when you don't know what to do or what to say or how to dress.
Helpful when you don't know what to do, what to say, or how to dress. What would indicate to you that at this moment, the relevance, it is important to know what to do this thing and not that thing? I mean, all of this is built in here.
And you know, the Jewish rituals for mourning the dead tell you what to do for all of those things. Traditions offer numerous and helpful rites, And that might also make some of us in this room nervous. The problems with traditions authoring our rituals may feel like a long train a-coming. As my Jewish friends tell me, they've been struggling with this problem for millennia. They feel the weight of the wealth of their ritual traditions, and this forces the big question. Where do my daily and regular rituals find their roots, and according to whom? On the whole, religious Jews tend to think of their religion not in terms of theology, but in terms of practice. What do we do when we're in situation X, Y, or Z? Should my ritual scripts come from deep within the history of my tradition, or can I improvise?
And why does history matter? So I've been trying to read through as many Tom Holland books as I can right now. And again, legitimacy is deeply tied to history. Why? Well, maybe because in a Jordan Peterson Darwinish way, we learn from the past in order to navigate the future, because the past is just a little bit more knowable than the future is.
The resolution to such quandaries always mixes tradition and improvisation, but should the ratio lean more towards past traditions or towards present freedom to improvise? In other words, who makes this stuff up? In the original...
You could just as well hear Joe Rogan and Andrew Doyle say, who makes this stuff up?
Draft, I said, we do. And then the editor struck it out.
We might ask, who is we?
Just a note. Christians face a similar quandary today. Although the Christian tradition is centuries long and rich in ritual, many of us have to plead ignorant in its existence, much less its bounty of rituals. In the book Deep Church Rising, the author suggests that we delve into the historic and the small c Catholic rituals of the church. And by studying and reappropriating the ritual life of the church that has always been prized, we can find a safe way forward. But maybe you, like me, shiver at the thought of studying Scripture and the history of the church in order to be guided by them today. But the sober reality is that you are currently being guided by many religious and cultural rituals already scripted out for you. The funeral machine has already scripted your final service. Just as the wedding machine has already planned your nuptial day, the worship music machine has already ritualized your Sunday morning songs, the sports machine has scripted and ritualized your leisure time, the fitness machine has scripted your exercise, which then shapes your vision of what an acceptable body looks like, and then maybe the shame or the hubris that accompanies it. The fashion machine has scripted every color, fabric, and cut that we are ritually wearing right now. The successful career machine, the career family balance machine, and more are pumping out the scripts of your rituals like priestly monkeys banging on liturgical typewriters.
Priestly monkeys banging on liturgical typewriters. I love it.
Need I go on? And all good rituals can be twisted, perverted towards an end not intended by God.
Now here, see, most of you have been listening fine all along, but once he said that word God, some of you got triggered. Some of you got triggered like, oh, he's of my tribe, he's safe. Others of you are like, oh, God, the dude up in the sky, all of this flying spaghetti monster. Okay, but, okay, the thing is, we're all situated in something, so this is a book written to Christians because Christians are trying to align themselves within a script, align themselves within a tradition, locate themselves within a community. That's all what Christians are doing. And maybe you weren't triggered by the Jew stuff. Maybe you weren't triggered by the Japanese phone thing. But once God came in, now you're triggered. Well, you might work on that. Triggering system so you can be a little bit more diverse and open.
Family meals can be gluttonized. Guilty. Nutrition can be anorexized. Exercise can descend into egoistic sports competitions and body bragging.
Now notice, suddenly we've got our moral ruler that we're putting up. And built into that moral ruler is obviously thousands of years of Christian tradition and theology and all those kinds of things. But what he's doing is now he's saying, okay, we're going to take these rituals and we're going to hold them up to the moral ruler and we're going to try to evaluate them. And this isn't terribly different from what Joe Rogan and Andrew Doyle are doing in terms of they've got their own implicit moral ruler. It's probably not terribly well defined. It isn't ritualized. It might not be examined very well. And like all of our moral rulers, it's probably a little bit of a work in progress, and we're always sort of doing some crowdsourcing with respect to it, but there it is.
Parenting can devolve into power struggles. Sexual intimacy can contort into pornographic reenactments. Scripture reading can be corrupted into daily doses of bibliolatry, the worship of the Bible itself. As one witty person, you know who you are, quipped to me, it's a ritual, eat ritual world. The cultural monkeys continually
eat ritual world.
Write and publish scripts for us, voices to whom we already listen. Yet Scripture reiterates throughout that we must understand God's instruction and how it has gone wrong in us.
It's so interesting that once, if you're spending a lot of time outside of this, when he starts talking about God and the Bible, there's a mode that moves, and now suddenly we're from one world into the next, and that world just made a whole bunch of you nervous or dismissive. Others of you suddenly felt comfortable. And so notice that this is all nested.
Only then can we faithfully practice.
Faithfully. That's a word about the relationship between them.
And improvise our ritual lives in community.
In other words, and we're going to play some Brett Weinstein a little bit later. In other words, what we're doing is exactly what Sam Harris doesn't think we do, which is we're always recalibrating, trying to figure out what do we need. And some of that is sort of now. And so before the tsunami, no one would have said, well, put up a phone booth and put up a phone. But now after the tsunami, after someone came out of there and said that helped, probably cities will do it again. Maybe it will happen in China depending on how far the coronavirus goes. On and on and on and on and on. This is how human beings work. And what religion is it's a much more organized way of trying to remember and manage and practice and help people get through time. Okay?
That's quite enough.
Okay, now they're going to play a little video here, which I'm going to play, and then they're going to go into a question and answer thing, and I'm going to jump into the middle of one of his answers because it's salient. But I thought the little video was cool too, so I'll play it. And this video only has like 300 views.
The rituals of life. They're handed down to us, from ordinary routines to sacred rites of passage. We embody and repeat these rituals. Washing clothes, playing video games, practicing long division, sizing up a plumbing job, scanning a spreadsheet, reading an X-ray. These scripted acts enable us to know the world. They form us, shaping our ability to see things others can't, to understand complexities others haven't yet experienced.
Now, notice the utilitarian function of ritual. Rituals allow us to see differently. Now, this gets me all the way early into John Vervaeke's early videos about shamanism, where I don't think it was in John's work, but someone had noted that, well, these Roman priests would look at chicken bones and use that to help navigate the future. And you'd say, well, what do chicken bones have to do with the future? Well, maybe the religious practice of focusing on chicken bones disrupted the native pattern recognition that the rest of the tribe was doing, and so the shaman now is open to seeing new patterns. Rituals have in some ways the reverse, because they disrupt sort of the zeitgeist which is flowing around, and the ritual from another from another time and place, maybe if it's a very old church, the divine liturgy, which is hundreds of years old, even in your own language perhaps, suddenly makes the world look different in a different way. And that can be helpful.
So, what rituals are we embodying? And how are they changing our understanding?
So that was fun. But I want to jump ahead to, I love that line, priestly monkeys banging on their ritual typewriters. I want to jump ahead to the question and answer, because I think this story illustrates it well.
That is creepy. I'm just gonna, I don't know, you guys don't know what just happened because we've never ever talked about this. I don't think I've talked to anybody. There was a section in that chapter that was excised by my editor, and probably rightly so, about one of those points in my life where you just kind of have
And if you look at Dru Johnson, you search for him on YouTube, on I think the publisher's website, he goes into his story. He's got a very interesting story.
I was a young man in the military working in Colombia. I was out on a patrol with Colombian conscripts. And in my mind, my dad was in Vietnam. He's a Vietnam vet. And so in my mind, movies, I brought my machete with me, and little did I know you don't need a machete to do patrol in the jungle.
Why would you bring your machete with you? Well, you've been formed by movies. And when we think jungle, well, we think Indiana Jones. We think a line of people. One person is hacking. Well, what is that? Well, that's a ritual. Well, in a sense, when you think about the child in the box, what is that? Hacking. You're bringing that to the box.
Because the last thing you want to do is let people know where you were. And when you hack down all the branches and make a little trail, you're telling everybody where you are.
Relevance realization.
Like, I just never thought about the logistics of that, right?
And we thought relevance was the jungle. No, relevance is also why you're in the jungle. Relevance is also who else may be in the jungle. Relevance is also what's on the minds of the other people in the jungle. Well, what does this have to do with ritual? Well, we'll find out.
Right? And so we're confronted by this jungle and these 15-year-old conscripts in galoshes and, carrying their beat-up effing foul rifles. They just head right out. And it was only as what I thought we were trudging through the jungle that I realized, oh no, we're on a trail. And they were very carefully bending branches back to make sure, there's the one in front would bend things out of the way, the one in the back would reconstruct the trail so that you couldn't see it anymore. And I just remember thinking, wow, I would totally get killed out here by myself without these 15-year-old kids. Like, it would just be over so quickly and I wouldn't even know it. Maybe a cool breeze I'd feel through my head as the bullet passed through. But
now think about that in the light of the puzzle box with the children. Why is it that the children operate the puzzle box in the way that they do and the chimps do not? Now, let's say you're, let's just say evolution, all right? However you feel about that word. Why did people outcompete monkeys? Does it have anything to do with all of that silly, I think that's what she called it, banging around? The nice woman in the nice scrubs thinks she knows what's going on. Maybe she does, maybe she doesn't. Maybe there's something built into the children that she's not seeing.
that was it. These are things you think about out in the jungle. But so I had a whole story about that in the chapter, which Lil very dutifully said, yeah, you don't need all that stuff. The military stuff is too heavy. So I left.
The editor thought it shouldn't be in there. Well, you know what? I think the editor was wrong. The editor had her own relevance realization. Well, that's not relevant to the chapter. No, I think that's extremely relevant to the conversation about ritual, in that the world is such a place that we don't know what's going on, and the degree to which we know that we don't know is a really helpful thing to know.
One military story only in there from boot camp. But that was a moment of awakening, which all I could think to myself is, how did they like look at this jungle and see trails?
How did they look at the jungle and see trails? Tick, tap, 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 tap. These 15-year-old conscripts walking around in galoshes, how did they look at the jungle and see trails? Well, apparently the Colombian military knew a thing or two about, well, which soldiers survive when you send them out? The ones who grew up in the city or the ones who grew up in the jungle? And what did they learn in the jungle?
And how could I be looking at the exact same thing and see nothing but jungle? And they're younger, and they're ill-trained. I came through the American military, so I felt like I had this good training. Their training was like hackneyed and out in the middle of the jungle, and I just, it was one of those humbling moments where I'm like, I think I need these 15-year-old kids around me. Like they might be useful. They might know a lot more.
They might be useful, and maybe I should pay attention.
Student workers.
Exactly. They seem to know a lot more than I do, and I should just shut up and learn.
Fabulous.
So how did you know that? That's what I'm trying to figure out. That's so weird.
I Googled it.
Okay.
No, it was because the season ended last weekend, and it was just weird that they connected as well as they did. You talk a lot about scriptlessness in the opening of your book, and then kind of throughout. And to guide us into this, you reference East of Eden quite a bit as a wonderful illustration of what scriptlessness can look like.
Yeah.
And by the time I arrived at the end of the thing, my question is there actually such a thing as scriptlessness? And I don't know if that needs unpacking or if that's a useful start.
Are humans, at this point in time, ever scriptless? Go back again to Brett Weinstein's 2 tracks. It's like a computer without an operating system is not a computer.
Yeah, and I got scriptlessness from an interview on NPR I was listening to, I think, Alif Baltaman, who just said that in her 20s she felt scriptless. And I was like, as soon as I heard that, I thought, that's exactly how we all feel in our 20s. Like, we don't know anything, and there's no there's no trails, right? Or it doesn't seem like there are trails, or all the trails have been removed and it's all been mushed over. Yeah, so I think at the end, I think you're right. There is no such thing as scriptlessness, but life at times feels very scriptless, right? And so it's in those moments. And I think death is a big one. I talk about the death rituals in the Hebrew Bible a bit, and I tie them to Joan Didion, the other D. Joan Didion, some of the things she says about just like, when somebody dies, it's not like you're missing them or they're lost. It's just like a void. Like it's just a occlusion where there's nothing there.
Now, again, pay attention to that. What does that mean? What was there before? How was it there? We imagine that, again, that the only stuff is this physical stuff and this material stuff. That's not the stuff that governs, because that stuff that is now no longer there with the death of the person, the physical body is no longer there. No, the person in your life. Well, then what exactly is your life? It's not just all the stuff. It's in whatever world we locate this life.
And we just don't know how to deal with nothingness. I mean, here's an interregnum plug. Chaos and order, right? And that we are not just order-making machines, but God has created us to actually like implot ourselves in a narrative. And sometimes the narrative gets whacked perpendicularly from the side, and you can't.
Now again, if you might have got triggered when he said God there, well, if you're just a 2020 secularist out there, just say universe. And that'll function to a degree for you. The universe, just go ahead and try it. People do it all the time. I hear it all the time.
But God has created an order, right? And that we are not just order-making machines, but
order-making machines. Are we logos making machines under the logos, in the image of the logos, the one who speaks order out of chaos?
But God has created us to actually like.
But the universe has made us to actually like
plot ourselves in a narrative.
Plot ourselves in a narrative. I would say God, but I know some of you get triggered.
Sometimes the narrative gets whacked perpendicularly from the side, and you can't know what to make of it. But I think that's actually a really dangerous, it's a good point to be at if you're surrounded by wise people. It's a really dangerous
Wisdom institutions.
place to be at if you're surrounded by fools. Because people will hand you scripts. So I give the example of, I have students who come to my office and they're depressed because of some life circumstance, and their roommates will just say, well, you just need to go like on a 36-hour video game playing binge.
Classic.
And I'm like, no, why would you do that? Like, why? And the that in that sentence is, why would you listen to your roommates? They're your same age. They have no experience. They have no wisdom. They don't know what this looks like 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later. I have people who are 10 and 20 years older than me that I constantly go to and say, what do the things that I'm doing right now, what do they look like after my kids have moved out, if they've gone to college, if they get married? So it's those moments where I think people will exploit you either for ill or...
Now, obviously, well, you want people with experience. And, Brett Weinstein's admonition that, well, ancient wisdom is always a function of context. Yeah. But the question of discerning context also has relevance realization questions built into it. Because what about the context is different, and what about the context is the same? That, too, is a difficult thing to ask. Now, let's go back to ritual. What does ritual do? And this is in some ways analogous to what I've often said about the Bible. What ritual tends to do is try to apply some consistency in the pattern of chaos around us, so that at least there's one unmovable point. Now, someone might say, well, let's talk about the scientific method. Well, what exactly is the scientific method? The scientific method is an attempt to nail down as many variables as possible so you only have to watch the interrelationship of as few things as possible. So if I do this, I get this outcome. If I do that other thing, I get that outcome. All of that is a practice within relevance realization. The difficulty is that almost any experiment we offer, it's really hard to get it down to these really tiny binary things. And when just with combinatorial explosion, another thing from Vervaeke's lecture, just with combinatorial explosion, okay, now we're watching 3 variables. Whoa, it's getting complicated. Where's all our math people? 4 variables, 5 variables. Well, in any specific situation, there's innumerable variables. And so what ritual does is just try to get a handle on the everything of everything so that we can get it down smaller to actually pay attention. Okay? And that's why that's key.
Or just not knowing any better, right? Or also, I get dating advice that I hear people report to me, or romance advice, and I'm like, and I'm trying to not say out loud, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And I don't usually succeed in holding that in, but...
And why would you want to hold that in? Well, that's wisdom too, because just being reactive doesn't really help you. You need to have patience and trust and timing and wait for the moment when you can sense the person is actually themselves open, receiving, available, and then you give it your shot.
But and it's always their roommates. But what their roommates are doing is they're handing them scripts. They think they're just giving advice, but they're actually handing them a script, and they just got handed that script from some TV show or from some sentiment they read somewhere in some novel or magazine. And so the call is to inspect those scripts, to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves, right?
That's in the Bible.
Yeah.
That's a thing.
Check ourselves before we wreck ourselves.
Our next seminar that we have up here will
Hezekiah 4:4.
Yes.
And you can ask Donald Trump Jr. whether or not that's in the Bible. So, scriptlessness, wisdom, how this works. Now, in some ways, the Enlightenment was a huge step forward because, well, we're going to, in the world is changing very quickly. The Protestant Reformation just, brings a ton of chaos. And the Enlightenment says, now we've got all these Christian variables. We used to just have, well, at least in the West, there was this other church over in the East. We just have this one. Now we have Catholics and Calvinists and Lutherans and Anabaptists and we've always had skeptics around. Not everybody's been going to church. Not everybody has bought into the, well, this is how religion works. And so let's limit the variables. And so this white paperness, well, the Enlightenment offers a vision of scriptlessness. What if we can just swoop it into and just have two variables and work on those two variables and use reason? It's like, well, that's a very powerful thing. And, Galileo, let's measure the ball on a track. And let's observe what's going on in the skies. We want to achieve certainty. Well, that's handy. Well, what will certainty? We'll do this and we'll get this out. Okay, but who's wanting it? Well, certainty is the handmaiden in many ways of other tyrannies, and certainty instrumentalizes the motive, and certainty instrumentalized is motivated by a dream of some agent wielding mastery over the world. And if you're looking at the YouTube instead of just listening on the podcast, that's Sauron's ring. Because what Joe Rogan and Andrew Doyle are really frustrated with is, I can manage all of these if then that things in my life, but people, they keep tapping on the top of the puzzle box. And they shouldn't. Well, they shouldn't. No, because what they really need to is get the candy out. Really? Is that what's important in that game? The people filming it aren't really motivated on the candy. They're looking for another kind of candy. They're looking at chimps and they're looking at little children and they're looking for something else. And other people watching this, now me watching this, I'm drawing a new conclusion out of it. All out of this one tiny little experiment of science. Well, it's way, way more complex than that. Certainty instrumentalized, we'll see if I can get it right this time, is motivated by a dream of some agent wielding mastery over the world. And if there's something we really want to colonize, it's other people. And, of course, the old religious game is the thing we really want to colonize is the gods, the meta-divine realm, or the big guy himself. In him we live and move and have our being. And people are in the way. Now, we keep trying to improve the script rationally. And this is what we keep hearing all of these admonitions towards. And this was one of the first Vancouver debate. I should probably listen to the other ones. I'm sure there's gems in there too. But there's just so many in this conversation that I keep going back to it.
Hence, what I think I see is the religious story itself makes some kind of sense if you adhere to it in a manner that you are obligated and have no tools with which to question it.
Religious people always have tools with which to question their religious stories, my friend. Religious people are no less questioning than people who are not religious, again, because I think we're all religious.
Then you will miss the fact that at this moment you might want to throw that story out.
But the problem is it doesn't make, and this is a problem with these heuristics in general, it doesn't make sense for the right reason, and that's why it's not.
And you presume to know that, well, let Peterson take it.
Not a reliable guide given other changes.
Right reason, reliable guide, other changes. What are the relevance in all of these things?
In the world, but with everything changing, you want to be making sense for the right reason. You don't want it like it's a useful fiction.
And how do you know the right reason? You're going to have certain variables remain the same so that you can hopefully try to track the others.
Have to be retired at a certain point. Useful truths stay true. I mean, because they're based on your engagement with reality. And so to take your point about pornography, which I think is totally valid, you could have a completely rational conversation in terms of human psychology and sociology and what you want society to look like about the corrosive nature of pornography, right? That's not, you don't have to be a Victorian prude to worry that there might be something wrong with the infinite availability of pornography to 13-year-olds and above. Right?
Now, let's ask ourselves, which camps, generally speaking, are having a higher track record in some of these camps? I mean, because looking at populations and how they stand with respect to positions, well, that's part of our relevance realization too.
Right. I mean, that's I don't know what generation of human beings we're raising in the current environment. It's quite worrisome, actually. But again, you don't have to invoke mythology to do that. And I would say the temptation to invoke mythology, to say, well, you actually,
So how do you do it?
Poseidon really gets pissed off when you masturbate.
How do you do it? How do you do it?
We
don't have a mechanism. We have no mechanism for controlling
that. Talk about the effects
moment.
on human relationships and your...
Mythology is the mechanism, Sam. That is the mechanism. Religion is how we try to navigate all of this.
Own mind and your own intention and the way you view other people.
Sam, that barely works for sex ed. It barely works for condom education.
What was that?
It barely works. Like those sorts of educational interventions to stop that kind of fundamental behavior have very little effect. People aren't nearly as amenable to behavioral changes as a consequence of rational educational interventions as you might hope. I mean, and that's part and parcel of very broad clinical literature.
They're not as amenable to dogmatic intrusions either. I mean,
they are, and that might be a problem. And there are problems with that.
Well, no, because they're, again, this is just...
What's really funny here is that Sam is arguing against science. That's what's really funny here. And because Sam's religion is saying, no, it's this kind of ritual that will achieve the ends I desire. And Jordan Peterson, as a clinical psychologist, saying, no, Sam, all of the sciencey stuff we do says, well, that old religion stuff, it really works a lot better if you want to achieve outcomes. But that's what we want, right?
Like the terror of God in that situation.
The problem is that even if you could make the case that a dogmatic attachment to one or another religion was better, all things considered, than being secular.
Please tell me, in what realm do you have time to consider all things? A human being. You don't.
Truly secular and truly rational. That one or another religion was better, all things considered, than being secular, truly secular and truly rational, right? It's vulnerable. It's vulnerable to every next thing we find out. I mean, that's why it's like you could have.
We're all always vulnerable to every next thing we find out. And the question is, how do we manage it? The people of Japan managed the next thing they found out, which was a tsunami that destroyed their community. And they, in a sense, created a micro-religion with a phone booth, and nobody's upset about that.
Said, if you go back, 200 years before the germ theory of disease, you could have said, well, all of these dietary taboos and taboos around, hand washing and foot washing, it's actually very wise.
We say that now. That's not why they said it then. What about the future us that looks at our germ theory today? Well, it's pretty practical. Has it contained coronavirus? Well, probably will soon, but I mean, it's a good theory, but we don't know, Sam.
Wisdom of the germ theory of disease was sort of built into our scripture, and people were surviving. There was a kind of differential level of survival based on those who really adhered to these practices and those who didn't. Okay, but it's blind to the actual variables. Like,
can you know the actual variable? That's the question.
Because there's nothing special about shellfish necessarily, or there's nothing special about pork necessarily, or whatever the example is. And once you get the actual variables in hand, then the whole edifice comes crashing down, and then
Once you get the actual variable in hand, the whole edifice comes crashing down. Well, it hasn't come crashing down, Sam. That's the point. You keep saying it must come crashing down. No, it has to come. It's not coming crashing down. We're just making new ones, because that's how human beings survive.
Really just want to understand the
Well,
variables that work.
Look, I don't know if the whole edifice comes crashing down, and it isn't clear to me that you want to claim that, because one of the things you did say in the moral landscape, and I think this is associated with your interest in spirituality, is that there is some baby mixed in with the bathwater. And the question is, how do we distill that out?
Yeah.
And the objections that you're raising are the objections that are, look how difficult it is to do the distillation. It's like, yeah, absolutely, man. And it's not like I'm a foe of the Enlightenment. I think you Enlightenment types, and I put Pinker in the same camp, radically overestimate the degree to that was a casus sui. It's like everyone was barbaric and superstitious until 1750, and some miracle occurred, and now we all became enlightened. Like there was a lengthy developmental history
clearly
of
we
that.
all haven't. I mean, this is hence our complaining about the problem. And most of the world hasn't had the Enlightenment yet.
True.
On some level.
Look, I'm no foe to the Enlightenment, but I think that it had a lengthy developmental history that is radically underplayed by the people who ground it purely in rationality.
It's clearly still developing. My point is, we should be able to agree that
it's clearly still developing. Go all the way back to the beginning of this video and Joe Rogan's observation that it's not an accident that a lot of the woke are atheists. Well, what has developed? We would have imagined that, well, rationality would develop. No. What does rationality try to do? Achieve outcomes. Where do these outcomes that the rationalists desire come from? And maybe they're just tapping the box.
having a worldview guided by a continuous, honest engagement with reality insofar as we can apprehend it is better than having a worldview solidified or anchored to unchanging ideas that were born of people who had none of our present tools.
That's just a straw man.
None of our present insights into.
Because the religious people are changing all over the place. They clearly are. Like I said, imagine the Dome of the Rock is gone. Would the nation of Israel reestablish sacrifices? Would Rush Dooney rush up there and say, finally, Ezekiel fulfilled?
To anything.
Well, it depends on the principles. It depends on the principles. Like I would say, there are situations where that clearly applies, but I think there are broad principles. And again, we should probably stop with this, I think.
Yep, we're about there.
Because I'm starting to get tired of it.
And because the whole conversation was Jordan and Sam, Jordan trying to create an argument and Sam just sort of kicking it over like he did again and again there. Well, we don't believe that. The evidence is that rational pursuit is of limited efficacy in human beings. Now, at least rational pursuit imagined like Sam is doing it there, because there are too many variables. And so what we're actually doing, what you're doing with religion, with ritual, is you're actually doing the documentation and the long human conversation to try to figure out all the basic questions. What is good? What is right? Who are we? Do we know what is baby and what is bathwater? Now, here's the interesting thing with the child in the puzzle box. The child knows that the gummy bear doesn't really come from the box. It comes from the one who brought the box. Our relevance realization hones in. We're trying to imagine, we're seeing through the eyes of this child. Well, the child doesn't consciously know. Child isn't wielding this conscious rationality. That the child is wielding a degree of rationality, but we don't even know what the child is pursuing. Maybe the child is trying to please the test maker. The real gummy bears come not so much from the child survival is all about getting gummy bears out of a puzzle box. The child survival is all about the bonds that the child has with these larger creatures who bring gummy bears and boxes into the room. What game is the child playing? The child doesn't know. The child can't answer on a test, but the child is doing it. Well, what does that teach us about religion? What does that teach us about ourselves? So we begin with these anxious comics. And why do we like Joe Rogan talking to Andrew Doyle? Well, we love hearing the tribal dispute about the woke. We want to hear the woke get bashed. And we want to hear Joe Rogan and Andrew Doyle, and they both got plenty of progressivist. They've got plenty of progressivist cred. They're all on board with all of the, well, maybe the 2013 check marks, maybe not the 2020 check marks, but they're anxious about the threat of religious tyranny destroying what they love. But ironically, the religious are no longer religious in the relevant ways that we imagined others were. What might we learn about what religion is by watching these anxious comics try to figure out, what was that line? Priestly monkeys banging on their ritual typewriters. I'm going to steal that. Sorry, Dru. Pastors are thieves. I'm going to steal that line. It's a great line. Your publishers, your editors, I think their relevance realization was a little bit off. I think it would have been a great title for a book. And I think that story about your combat experience should have been in the book.